I'm retired now. It wasn't exactly my idea. It just happened a little while ago. My career is now officially behind me. So it's natural, I suppose, to try to get perspective, to think back to the beginning, back to when that mysterious and elusive career still lay in front of me. So I'm going to tell you a story that begins with a special project that started it all, a little film dear to my heart. It's a project that now bookends my days of working on this earth, embellished by all the marvelous things that God has done in the years between. July 4th, 1976, the day I was joined to Maureen Lane, the love of my life, in Colorado Springs, Colorado. We were all of 20 years old, kids full of ambitions, dreams, and fears. But now we each had a partner at our side as we plunged headlong into a tentative future. As unimaginable as it seems now, it was a time before cell phones, before personal computers, no email, no home video even, no internet, no online shopping, no social media, no digital cameras. Film was pretty much the only way for mortals to record an image, moving or not. And I wanted to be a filmmaker, a Hollywood director even. I wanted to move the hearts of audiences to laughter and tears. I wanted to somehow make a difference in people's lives. We rattled away from our wedding in our $200 1962 Rambler wagon, laden with all our worldly goods, utilizing our meager honeymoon journey as a means of returning me for my third year of film school at USC in South Central Los Angeles.
Welcome to Hollywood, you Midwestern sons and daughters. Oh, welcome.
While my farm girl bride would be adjusting to the major culture shock of the big city, I was to be the editor on a Cinema 480 project being directed by my pal Cliff Johnson. A 480 film was and is the pinnacle production level at USC Cinema. You might call it a thesis film. They only greenlight a handful of them each semester for production. And also, if you wanted to actually direct one, you had to have served as a crew member on another 480 as a prerequisite. So I was serving my time, nurturing my dreams of later grandeur. For now, my focus became this production titled Laugh in the Dark. It was the director's semi-autobiographical story about an idealistic kid working on cheesy amusement park rides. Conflict ensues as the young man is forced to reconcile his creative idealism with the realities of commerce. Truth be told, it's a pretty terrible film, not that we could admit that, even to ourselves at the time. Nevertheless, its themes, such as they were, would echo down the corridors of my career, as you'll see soon enough. Both director Cliff and myself were also serving part-time in the fall of 1976 as teaching assistants in the USC animation department. We had a good relationship with Professor Gene Coe, who ran the department. Now, it so happened in those days that occasionally outside companies and productions would do their recruiting at USC Cinema. One day, Gene Coe received a call from the production of a science fiction movie that was doing post-production in the San Fernando Valley. They were running behind schedule and they were seeking student slave labor to help finish the visual effects. In those analog photochemical days, visual effects were still dark arts. But I had informally studied visual effects techniques since I was in high school, and that pre-knowledge was one of the things that landed me the teaching assistant gig in the animation department. So I got this company's phone number from Professor Gene, hopped in the Rambler and headed over the hill to Van Nuys for an interview at a place called Industrial Light and Magic. You guessed it, that science fiction movie was something called Star Wars. I knew of the title, thought it sounded really cool, was already a big fan of Lucas from American Graffiti. In fact, American Graffiti had motivated my choice of USC as my alma mater. So I definitely wanted to see what they were up to in that warehouse on Valjean Avenue. What I saw there was pretty much what I expected. a grubby environment with islands of high-tech cameras, miniatures, and even computers running the cameras. This was certainly the future. I sat and chatted with a guy named George Mather, with John Dykstra poking his head in occasionally while production assistants scurried about. Dykstra's flea-infested Irish setters had the run of the place and made me itch. I got a tour, though. When I laid eyes on the 4-foot miniature of the pirate ship that ultimately would become known to the world as the Millennium Falcon, I knew this film was going to be a smash hit. I did. I really did. As we talked, they were trying to figure out where to fit me in. They discussed making me an optical printer operator. It was all overwhelmingly exciting for a kid from Colorado. And I turned them down. No, it wasn't just the fleas, and sure, it was a decision that may have been a mistake. But it was not as tough nor as foolish a decision as you might think. I needed to finish school. People had made sacrifices so that I could attend this expensive university. In addition, I had made commitments to my teammates on Laugh in the Dark and didn't want to leave them in the lurch. I finish what I start. But most importantly, I had read Frank Capra's book, The Name Above the Title. I knew that creative control was and is the holy grail in Hollywood. My options were these. I could either sign on with Star Wars, become a technician, and be a cog in the works while somebody else called the shots forever, or I could roll the dice on doing my own 480 film the following year, show the world what a brilliant, creative filmmaker I was, and launch my career at a higher level, or at least have a shot at it. Becoming a technician was a guaranteed dead end creatively, so at that point in my career it was not that difficult a decision. So we finished Laugh in the Dark, and it became the cinematic classic that no one has ever heard of since. And then the following spring of 1977, I enrolled in Gene Coe's advanced animation class for a second time so that I could make a second experimental animation film. The first one was spring semester of '76. This time I managed to convince the school to have their Oxbury animation camera modified so that it could do streak and slit scan effects. When they miraculously agreed, I created a graphical film based on Chapter 21 of the Book of Revelation. I didn't know it at the time, but this was the film that would later figure heavily in my entry into the business. But even while working on Chapter 21, I knew I had to be getting prepared to pitch an idea for a 480 project to the faculty, an idea I didn't even have yet. It was about that time that a tsunami hit the world. That tsunami was the phenomenon of Star Wars. As expected, it was a smash. We USC students even got invited to screen an answer print at Fox Studios. It was all great fun. Did I have regrets about not being part of that excitement? I don't remember any. After all, I was going to direct my own epic. But still, that galaxy far, far away was not finished with me yet. Preparing to enjoy my summer break from school, I received a call from my filmmaking mentor, Paul Franklin, back home in Colorado Springs. He ran a local commercial production company, and they'd just landed a contract with an amusement park ride manufacturer located in northern Colorado. This company had created a primitive simulator ride called the Astroliner, and they needed a film to go inside it. Naturally, they now wanted Star Wars, since that was all the rage, for a minuscule budget, of course. They contacted my buddy, and he contacted me. The mission was to recreate something like Star Wars in an amusement park ride, the kind you get at county fairs. I was just a kid, mind you, but now I was supposed to recreate the thrills of Star Wars all by myself. I would be echoing the character in Laugh in the Dark, working solo building amusement rides. Interestingly, Colorado Springs had an outfit called Alexander Film Services, a faded local studio and lab that in its day used to do trailers and commercials for theaters in the local market and elsewhere. They still had a functioning 35mm Oxbury animation crane, an optical printer, and editing facilities. As for me, I was fairly well versed in the techniques used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'd written term papers about them. I'd used them in Chapter 21. 2001 had largely been done on an Oxberry. I knew how to use an Oxberry. Ipso facto, now I had a crazy summer job and my first opportunity to work with 35mm motion picture equipment. So we moved back to Colorado Springs for the summer. There, in my parents' basement, I set about doing storyboards, building miniatures, and creating graphical elements to mimic the work that large crews of talented artists and technicians at that warehouse in Van Nuys had accomplished. Yes, I was insane. It was always insane.
Captain, it's an Archon fighter ship. Secure all port shields.
Look to starboard! More Archon ships!
Engine room, full power to evade.
But for what it's worth, we ultimately delivered what I had storyboarded, for better or for worse. Given the limitations, it probably couldn't have come out much better. Call it summer on-the-job training. But perhaps the most interesting thing about the Astroliner is that it represented an embryonic Star Tours, the Disneyland ride that wouldn't open for another decade. Astroliner may have been primitive, but it was way ahead of its time. We returned to LA in the fall of 1977, and I began my quest in earnest for ideas for a 480 project proposal. In my search for inspiration, one of the things I did was go back to the well that Uncle Walt had dipped from so often, Grimm's Fairy Tales. I checked out a thick volume of these classic tales from the school's library. You know, that building with books in it from before there was an internet. And I started reading story after story. But it wasn't working out so well. I became discouraged at just how terrible most of the folk tales actually were. Many of them consisted of mere strangeness with little rhyme or reason. Senseless cruelty, violence, and lack of humanity permeated most of them. But I kept reading, hoping to stumble onto some undiscovered nugget that Walt had overlooked. Eventually I came upon a tale called King Thrushbeard. Eureka! This story had it all. Sin, redemption, romance, spectacle, laughs, tears, and even a bit of a surprise ending. Yep, this was the one. I cobbled together a script, melding the story with bits of another tale called The Dancing Princesses to give the heroine a bit of more human depth. Beyond that, I added humor and character details that more firmly held the story together. The title, King Thrushbeard, essentially gives away the surprise ending, so I concocted the more generic Cabbages and Kings or The Dancing Princess. It sounds classical. It also sounds like the title of an early Hollywood film. But how was I to get a sweeping costume epic with castles and ballrooms under the screen with a budget of a mere $1,750? My visual effects instincts started to kick in. Shooting it all in front of a blue screen was an idea, but in that pre-digital age, doing blue screen composites was full of voodoo and prohibitively expensive, and usually the results were not very good. Besides, nobody at USC knew how to do it, including me at the time. So blue screen was not an option. Ironically, if I had taken the Star Wars gig, cranking out blue screen mats would likely have been all I was doing. Telling our story using animation was another possibility, but not a realistic one either, considering the limited resources and labor hours available in a school semester. Besides, I wanted to work with actors and shoot live action. In my advanced animation class, though, I had become enamored of the works of a German filmmaker named Lotte Reiniger, who made fairy tale movies using delicate cutout silhouette puppets. Also, as an animation teaching assistant, I had additional access to the equipment in the animation department, so I knew it would be smart to leverage that somehow. I came up with the concept of doing a Lotte Reiniger-style silhouette movie, but utilizing live actors instead of animated puppets, combining them with animated backgrounds and some animated characters. Could that actually work? Could I sell the idea? In order to do so, I had to recruit a crew, prepare a presentation and a pitch for the faculty committee who would choose the projects that would go into production the following semester. December of 1977. The film's crew was recruited in the traditional fashion by posting on bulletin boards around the cinema department. No social media, remember? In my post, I attempted to differentiate from all the competing projects in order to entice the best crew candidates by asking the question in bold type, "Tired of working on talking head mini-dramas?" thereby casting shade on the implied low value of the competition, projects similar to Laugh in the Dark, by the way. And then I proceeded to push the novelty and fantasy angles of my little project. Was it arrogant? You bet. But it attracted a stellar crew and a merry band of great volunteers to boot. Little did they all know that what we would be creating was merely a silhouette version of a talking head mini-drama, a fact that one of my grumpy peers gleefully brought back to haunt me after a class screening. The official crew, those who would receive school credit for the 480 class, would consist of 5 people. First aboard was Mike McAllister, a laid-back guy with a construction background. Like the rest of us, Mike came without a resume, but I nervously signed him on as director of photography. A selling point was that he was interested in the weirdo animation stuff as well. That, combined with his talents as a tinkerer, really made him the perfect fit for our oddball problem-solving requirements. Next to join the team was a gentleman named Mike Wood, who came on as production manager. He was the only grad student aboard, so his experience, coupled with his boundless patience, solved some of our deepest challenges, and he was indispensable in getting images on the screen. Not only was he entrusted with managing the budget, but he managed to negotiate the loan of costumes from the local opera company. He wrangled unpredictable actors, booked a volunteer orchestra, and still managed to function as boom operator during shooting. Adding to his duties in this show, Mike also played the priest that marries the princess and the fiddler, and as a professional organist, he even played the pipe organ heard during that scene. Mike's great patience and good humor somehow got us through, and he later went on to a career as a beloved faculty member at Kansas State University. The third member of the crew, signing on as editor, was an affable fellow named Jay Horan. Like the others, I hadn't had any classes with Jay and didn't know anything about him other than he seemed nice enough. He did have one resume enhancer. He had been Mike Wood's partner in a previous production class. That was doubly valuable in that not only did he have a reference, but it meant we already had the beginnings of teamwork before we even started. The best thing about Jay, like the others, was that he was able to put up with my craziness. The last person to join us was our sound man, Frank Amsden. 480 crews always have trouble casting the role of sound supervisor. Nobody ever seems to want to do it. But we needed all 5 crew positions filled in order to be able to even pitch the project. Frank needed the 480 credit and was willing to take the sound gig, so he was in. Done deal. So we had a complete crew, but it was only a crew of wannabes. We still had to run the gauntlet of pitching it to the committee. I knew the concept would seriously push the limits of a meager budget, but I had figured out ways of spinning it for the powers that be. That snake oil skill alone proved I must have been becoming a real filmmaker. To compensate for the complexity of the proposed project, I knew I would have to go for overkill in this pitch in order to gain approval to actually go into production. Besides, this was my shot, my one shot. My entire career, as I saw it, hung on the success or failure of this presentation. And even if it was a success, the film might still be the only one I would ever be allowed to direct. Hollywood is a cruel town, so we had to shoot for the moon. I prepared not only the script and a technical proposal, but I also created full-color storyboards for the entire film, illustrating exactly what we wanted to do. The big day came and we filed into the stuffy, crowded room to make our pitch. I don't remember much after that. What I do remember is that, though I was nervous, stuttering, and naive, for some reason selling the concept and the script to the faculty turned out to be a piece of cake. I don't remember even speaking very much. They had read the script, so they were familiar with the material, and, nearly unheard of for this committee, they had no major notes on the script itself. It seems I had them with the color storyboards. They didn't see that very often in those days. They must have been making bets on when we would crash and burn. But ours was one of the few hallowed productions they chose. They liked me. They really liked me. I swallowed hard, and we were off to the races. On January 28, 1978, we began casting for the production of Cabbages and Kings. At that time, the drill was, if you needed actors for your student film, you put a free casting ad in a publication called Drama Log. All the out-of-work actors constantly monitored Drama Log, and you could end up with a lot of applications to perform in your piece, even though they would be working for free. It was good experience and good practice for the acting community, and a huge boon for us poverty-stricken filmmakers. The only danger was, you could get a lot of weirdos in the mix, and you had to deal with them somehow. So we scheduled a casting call for a single weekend, and, like clockwork, the thespians came out in force. For our leads, we were very fortunate.
Your music has pleased me so much I am giving you my daughter for your bride. Where is she? Daughter! Wow! Come down here, there's someone I want you to meet.
Oh, all right. In a minute.
You are indeed gracious, sire, but I feel
Tut,
that I...
tut, no need to thank me, you lucky fellow, you.
But sire...
Please say no more.
All right. Who's he?
Daughter, I want you to meet your new husband.
Daddy, you wouldn't. You couldn't. I'm not going with a smelly old beggar.
You will, or it's the dungeon with you. It's about time you...
The role of the princess was filled by an actress named Nouri Ibars. She was shy and soft-spoken, but she had some dance experience and a great presence and a delightful English accent. Though she hailed from Argentina, she had been educated in England. It seemed a no-brainer now, but it was her initial reading that made me realize the entire cast would need to affect an English accent. Doing so would give the piece an authentic European fairy tale atmosphere. So obvious. Yet, surprisingly, the character vocal accents had never been on my radar all the time I had been writing the script. I was new to this, okay? Thankfully, my dialogue still worked with the new affectations. Also, thank goodness for this delightful actress. Nouri gave us laughs when we needed laughs, elegance and pathos when we needed that. There really never was any other serious contender for the role, and the film stands solidly on her performance. For the part of the princess's father, we ended up with a fellow named Donovan Scott. He was not exactly the type I had written the part for. He did a reading the way I requested it, and it was kind of flat. We said thank you and moved on to guys that were more of what I was looking for, or at least on paper. But they weren't floating my boat either. Donovan came wandering back saying he had a different approach that he wanted me to see. I said, sure, why not? He was right. It worked, and that is the character you see on screen. Scotty was a tremendous creative and comic force that supported all around him. He was a problem solver. We were so blessed to have him. He also ended up playing several other bit parts, including voicing the animated character of the Duke of Gluttony. Later in his career, he ended up with a key role in an Olivia Newton-John video, appeared in Back to the Future 3 and Police Academy. He also had a starring role in an independent feature called Savannah Smiles. The role of King Ludwig went to a television actor named Gareth McLean. He was the only one of the cast with some semi-serious credits, such as soap operas. Consequently, he had a shade of the prima donna in him that constantly gave Mike Wood, our production manager, heartburn just trying to get him to show up. Once Gareth determined that we seemed to know what we were doing, however, he seemed to become a bit more reliable. In the end, he delivered. He provided just the proper romantic straight man persona to anchor the other characters and allow everyone to shine. In the process, he put up with a lot, having molds taken of his face and things glued to it. We were extremely fortunate to have him. For such a short film, Cabbages and Kings has a lot of supporting characters. Some were animated, some were drama log recruits, and, being the lean production that it was, some of the roles were filled by folks from the crew. The cameraman became a soldier, the editor portrayed a gossipy courtier, the production manager a priest, the director a court crier, the director's wife a mocking townsperson. And speaking of the director's wife, my wife, Maureen, in addition to appearing on screen briefly, she personally created many of the film's costumes. She kept the cast and crew fed. She even rode the runaway horse, only to have her image erased in post-production. She helped with makeup, and she did all this while working full-time in an office during the week and putting up with my obsessions morning to night. She now refers to it as her year from hell, but for some reason, after all these years, she's still with me. In my classes at USC, I had been exposed to a lot of classic Hollywood films, and I'd become fascinated with the look and feel from the 1930s and 40s, especially those in Technicolor. So one of our stated goals when we began the production of Cabbages and Kings was that the film should feel like it was made in the early golden days of Hollywood. That's why the titles are designed the way they are, for instance. Stylistically, it was one way we could best leverage all the school's antique equipment, embrace the old ways. We were the first crew in years to use the school's 16mm Mitchell camera, for instance. Technically, we chose it because its superior mechanism gave us the best chance at a stable image for later compositing. But its huge housing was also something Errol Flynn would have been familiar with. Likewise, even though newer microphones were available, we chose to use old and fragile ribbon mics to get that mellow, classic Hollywood sound. We filmed our performance against a white screen, illuminated by thousands of watts blasting from ancient lighting instruments. Because we were using a special high-contrast black and white film stock that was not very sensitive to light, we needed lots of light just to get an exposure, and even more light to get the screen to go purely clear on film. In addition to using lots of power, this light came with a tremendous amount of heat. On the small, unvented soundstage, the temperature rose very quickly when the lights were on. Fortunately, we were filming during a season when it was often cool and rainy outside, so between takes the stage doors could be opened and let some cool air back in. But with all that heat also comes perspiration. When the actors perspired, their faces would become shiny, potentially resulting in reflections, which would cause part of their image to become transparent in the final shot. Our solution was for the cast to perform with dark makeup in order to keep the reflections under control. After some initial tests, we determined we were going to have difficulty achieving the shots as they had been storyboarded, with the characters' feet grazing the top of a black ground surface. Perspective in the real world doesn't work that way unless the actors are walking on the edge of a board or the camera is at ground level. But with a low camera angle, your actors would all look like giants. Cameraman Mike McAllister came up with the gimmick of using a raked stage platform. Classical theatrical stages were raked or slanted, so that they were lower in front and higher in the back, hence the theater terms upstage and downstage. This type of stage can give an illusion of greater depth and provides better visibility for a theatrical audience. However, Mike's breakthrough idea for our production was to slant the stage the other way, with the backside lower than the front. This way the camera could always look on the edge of the platform, while the performers had plenty of room to move around on the playing surface. And the camera could shoot it all from a normal viewing height. It took me a while to wrap my head around this odd perspective concept, but in the end I had to admit it was brilliant. It made my original concepts doable. And better yet, Mike strapped on his tool belt and built the unique platform himself. Even if I was a neophyte, I could now see I was in good hands. Several years later, Mike's tinkering talent went on to win him an Oscar for his innovative work on Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. In a film that was potentially very static due to the restrictions of the way we were filming it, we tried to design shots that would open up the scope of the story as well as to keep the camera moving. So tricks like treadmills came into play. Real dolly moves were sometimes employed on set that would later be matched and expanded in the background photography. And we even used a primitive multiplane rig on our animation camera for a few scenes just to make Uncle Walt proud. Since we were students, we went to class all week and did our filming on the weekends.
Attention please. It is time to sign the security list. If you wish to work in the building over the weekend, you must sign the security list. This is the first and last note.
After 4 weeks of shooting, the filming wrapped. About the only noteworthy event was that at one point the cinema faculty was giving a tour of the building to George Lucas, and he poked his head into our set for a brief moment. It was a low-key event that almost went unnoticed. All told, the shoot was fairly efficient and successful. We managed to do what we needed to do as a team, somehow avoiding too many egos getting in the way, and getting most shots done in 2 takes or less in order to stay on budget. But now we had to shoot the whole movie again in post-production. After the black and white dailies were edited, the originals of the chosen takes would be bipacked or sandwiched with unexposed color stock as it was run through our Oxberry animation camera to photograph the background artwork. Thus the silhouette footage would cast its shadow on the new color film while it was recording the paintings, resulting in a composite image where the background image is of highest quality, being a first-generation image. In addition to adding actors to a background, this process could also be used, by shooting 1 frame at a time, to add animated characters and effects to a scene that could interact with the live characters. But there was one more layer of complexity we heaped upon ourselves. The design of a number of our shots required the use of optical printing. Either repositioning or duplicating elements in the school's optical printer allowed the creation of shots we couldn't achieve in camera on the stage. Most of these opticals were fairly simple, but they still had to go through the optical process to get to completion. In fact, every shot in the movie had to go through some sort of camera at least 3 times. Post-production was proceeding apace, and the number of remaining optical tasks began to shrink. Then, kerchunk! The school's optical printer rolled over and died. After a few sessions of misbehaving, it finally just wouldn't budge anymore. It was a disaster. And finishing Cabbages and Kings depended on that beast of a machine. Yet despite the USC administration putting out calls for help, no one could be found in Los Angeles to service the ailing behemoth. I don't know who the school was contacting to fix it, but apparently all they got across town was shrugs. The manufacturer had long gone extinct. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put the printer back together again. Though we were able to do our sound mix and continue with as many non-optical composites as we had in the pipeline, the lack of optical output brought production of a big chunk of the film to a halt. The situation dragged on for weeks until finally we were unable to screen our finished film for the big end-of-the-semester premiere of the year's latest 480s. Instead, what went up on the big screen in Norris Theater for our classmates and industry guests was a film that was still half black and white. Our moment of triumph ended up being a big thud of embarrassment. The hope of some cigar-chomping producer shaking my hand after the screening and offering me a 3-picture development deal evaporated like the fantasy it always was. What's worse, weeks passed. Even commencement came and went. I finished classes, got a grade, walked the aisle, but Cabbages and Kings still remained in limbo. And yet I now had to go forth to try to begin my Hollywood career, and do so without what I'd hoped to be my signature film under my arm. It was the summer of 1978. I saw an article in Daily Variety that a big chunk of the visual effects for Star Trek the Motion Picture had just been awarded to Robert Abel & Associates, a design studio I greatly admired. I figured if Star Wars would hire college kids, maybe Star Trek would do the same. This time I needed the job. Somehow I managed to get a meeting with a fellow there named Richard Taylor and got him to take a look at Chapter 21, my animation film project. He was enthusiastic enough to hire me pretty much on the spot, but not for Star Trek. He thought maybe they could use me in their commercials division. The quintessential example of Abel's commercial work was a 7-Up commercial titled Bubbles from 1974 that had not only caught the imagination of the industry, but also myself to the point where it had partially inspired my film Chapter 21. Anyway, I started at Abel's and hung out there for a week. But they never really found anything for me to do. Perhaps there were politics. Maybe it was a budget problem. Whatever it was, after a few days I found myself back out on the street. It wasn't to be the last time I would be fired, but at the same time this wasn't the first time Chapter 21 had at least gotten my foot in the door. A year previous, at another less disastrous screening in USC's Norris Theater, there was another industry showcase for the year's batch of student films. That year's crop had included my film Chapter 21, freshly finished at the time. A day or so later, I got a call from a gentleman named Ron Seawright. He got my name from an animation designer named Frank Furlong, who had attended the screening and liked my work. Mr. Seawright was part of a group that had risen from the ashes of a former heavyweight Hollywood commercial studio called Cascade Pictures of California. They were the studio that brought the Jolly Green Giant and the Pillsbury Doughboy into the public consciousness. This new group of former Cascade executives and refugees called themselves CPC Associates. Interestingly, it turned out I was exactly the guy they were looking for. My skills filled precisely the hole they needed to fill in their roster. And perhaps at that point in my life, they were exactly what I needed to learn and grow. Still, as with Star Wars, I told them, thanks, but I gotta finish school. Unlike Star Wars, however, CPC kept in contact with me during the year while I was completing my degree. The management handed me over to a guy named Sam Powell. He'd done stints at MGM and with Chuck Jones' studio and knew his way around the animation business in Hollywood. He was a nice family man, probably 10 years my senior. What the guys at CPC wanted Sam and I to do was to create a department that would emulate the kind of motion graphics that Robert Abel and Associates were doing at the time. It seems backlit airbrush animation was to be my destiny. Now you know why I was filling the hole they were trying to fill. Anyway, the CPC guys christened our new department with a completely cringeworthy branding name, Laser Light Animation. If I had been working at Robert Abel's studio, I would have been learning from the giants of the industry. But at CPC, we were the new wannabe kid on the block. I had to invent it all myself and learn as I went along. And yet we still had to try to compete with the big guys. It was certainly a great opportunity to learn. It was also a bad idea for CPC to put all their eggs into my basket, but since most of the projects we got were relatively inconsequential things like Mexican commercials, I had the opportunity to take chances and make mistakes. Any successes helped to build the demo reel, and though we had very little opportunity to do any high-end projects, I still got to work alongside experienced visual effects folks like Harry Walton, Jim Danforth, David Allen, and Chris Nibley. In addition, legendary animator Tex Avery chose to make the CPC offices his home during his latter years. He was a mentor, teacher, and inspiration to all of us. But as I was getting settled into this new world at CPC, I got the notice. USC's optical printer was back in operation. Professor Gene Coe had apparently begged John Huber, the Oxbury technician who kept the entire industry running, to take a look at a machine that was not supposed to be in his purview. But Mr. Huber made it happen as he always did, and we were able to finally move toward completing Cabbages and Kings. Mike McAllister and myself took time off of our day jobs to come back to campus and do the final bits. He did all the Oxbury work, I did at least some of the optical printer work, and I ended up doing the final negative assembly alone in an editing bullpen that was now deserted because it was summer. The reels were assembled and shipped off to the lab for printing. Somehow UPM Mike Wood arranged for us to have our own premiere screening of the finished film at USC's prestigious Norris Theater. It took place on December 15, 1978. We tried to make as big a deal out of it as we could on short notice, and without the amenities of social media and email. I tried unsuccessfully to convince Tex Avery to come, but in the end I just don't remember much about that screening. I remember it being pretty low-key. I don't think there were more than several dozen attendees in the cavernous theater, and I don't recall the film generating all that much excitement with the audience. I do remember some student at the screening asking for my autograph, the one time in my life that would ever occur, and then it was all over. We had finished what we set out to do, and we all went on with our lives and our careers, most of us never to see each other again. Cabbages and Kings would continue on, however. It got a nice blurb from Hollywood Reporter critic Arthur Knight. It got written up as a multi-page article in the American Cinematographer magazine. It went on to win some film festivals. It even won the grand prize in one New York festival. But perhaps the film's biggest honor was that it actually got a distribution deal. That's practically unheard of for a student film. In fact, the whole system is practically designed to prevent it. But a Pasadena educational distributor called Bar Films licensed it from USC and distributed it to schools and local cable access networks. So someone saw value in our little fairy tale, and as a result, it actually continued to have an audience beyond the winter of 1978. So now that it was finally done, you're probably wondering whether Cabbages and Kings did anything for my career. Did it give me a boost and make me a powerhouse creative force? Or did it pigeonhole me as a guy who just did weirdo silhouette animation-y visual effectsy stuff? Well, stick around and find out. So we went on with our lives. Just a few months after Cabbages and Kings was born, our family gave birth to another little princess. She was born at our apartment in the heart of Hollywood because my employer's insurance didn't cover maternity costs. But little Bonnie Marie became the center of our universe. I continued working at CPC, directing a few commercials, doing lots of flying logos, and learning as I went. Initially, it was all done manually with the skills I had learned in school on their equipment. Slowly, new technologies were creeping in out of necessity as the industry progressed. We started associating with tinkerers and vendors who were adding things like computer control and fancy endoscopic lenses to cameras. But it was all still done on a garage-type budget. I soaked up techniques and technology as much as I could. What I grew tired of was working on commercials and industrials. I wanted to tell stories that would touch the human heart. Commercials, I felt, were toilet paper movies. Use them and flush them. Enviously, I watched my friends working on exciting Hollywood blockbusters while I toiled away on flying logos. It was a living, but it was a rung of the ladder on which I would remain for another decade. During the daytime in the 1980s, I would make incremental progress learning some of the new 3D computer graphics software and pushing the limits of motion control animation camera work. At night, I would bang away writing spec screenplays, hoping to find myself a break somewhere. The scripts I wrote may have been good, or they may have been bad. I was pretty proud of some of them, but sadly I could never get anyone of consequence to even read them. There's this defensive wall Hollywood constructs by labeling works as unsolicited, which classify them as deadly kryptonite, making them untouchable, thus protecting the establishment from any interloper encroachment on their creative territory. Obviously, there are ways to break through the unsolicited logjam, or no films would ever get made, but I was never able to discover a way. For me, at least, the wall was impenetrable. So I kept doing visual effects for commercials, working for small, struggling animation houses, raising my family, working with my church. Remember Astroliner, the prehistoric Star Tours? In 1987, the real Star Tours premiered at Disneyland. As it turned out, our Cabbages camera guy, Mike McAllister, ended up as a primary camera operator on that original version. Later, I myself was involved in the 2011 refresh version. Slowly, in the 1980s, I started to do more interesting commercials. Occasionally, we'd get a sequence for a TV episode or even a couple of shots for a feature. At least that was getting closer to doing what I wanted to do, though actual directing drifted farther and farther from my grasp. In the mid-1980s, I was working at a small studio in Burbank with a couple of computerized animation stands. We were doing a great deal of slit scan work. Slit scan was a fairly sophisticated technique that allowed you to get dimensional effects and perspective shifts from flat art in the days before CGI. It used the computerized control of camera moving mechanisms to paint an image onto a frame over a long time exposure. We were pretty good at it, and our services came to the attention of a company called DreamQuest, who used to farm their slit scan out to us. So we got a relationship going with some of their directors. From about 1984 to 2002, the bulk of my income came from work done for DreamQuest, even though up until 1993 I was not yet on their direct payroll. For a couple of years in the early 90s, I worked for a computer graphics studio called Sidley Wright and Associates. It was a partnership formed by refugees from a now defunct, wait for it, Robert Abel and Associates. It was even in the same building as Abel had been, on Highland in Hollywood. I was learning slowly that there is one thing certain about all visual effects facilities, and that is that they will go out of business. It's only a matter of when. Now at Sidley Wright, for the first time I was working for a facility that had no animation stands, the tool of my trade for 20 years. I had by that time taught myself Photoshop and was assisting them in doing some digital ink and paint work that they had landed. I also helped art direct some of their CG output and acted as liaison for them with my pals at DreamQuest, who by this time were farming their CG work out to Sidley Wright. It worked out for everyone. Meanwhile, DreamQuest saw the writing on the wall and realized they had to get into digital film effects. They were developing their own homebrew scanning, recording, and compositing systems. Their technical guys had it far enough along that they needed to start using it in production. They invited me and a gregarious fellow named Mark Galvin to come in and run their new division called Motion Pixel Corporation. So in January of 1993, I became a full-time employee of DreamQuest Images. I was given the title of Visual Effects Supervisor. This was a major advancement for me. I'd paid my dues for 16 years. Not only could I now become involved in storytelling projects instead of just commercials, but I now had a title with a company big enough in size and status that it could allow me to move ahead in my career. Though this gig wouldn't technically get me any closer to actual directing, at least I would have a tiny bit of creative input into how a scene was put together. After all, don't tell the DGA this, a visual effects supervisor is really just a third unit director, a guy who supervises shots for a film which may or may not be created on set. So for the next 9 years I had a ball. While the founders of DreamQuest reserved all the big, high-budget, high-profile projects for themselves, that left me to pick up the TV movies, the comedies, and theme park projects on their schedule, and that was okay by me. The budgets may have been smaller, but the politics and the pressures were far less intense. And occasionally the clients actually appreciated what we tried to do for them. I even got to travel to exotic places, work with production teams, and help, even if it was only in a small way, shepherd the films toward being the best they could be. In my misplaced pride, I rarely received the respect I thought I had earned, but who cares? I was making movies.
The first is the team from Earth 2.
In 1995, shortly after my 40th birthday, I even managed to win an Emmy Award for a science fiction TV pilot called Earth 2. During that same period, a great deal of the work that was coming through DreamQuest was for Disney. It was only a matter of time before the lawyers came knocking. Disney decided to purchase DreamQuest Images. Though the deal made sense from a number of perspectives, it was actually accomplished in a rather ham-fisted manner, displacing management, moving the company to Burbank with a new name, an odd new branding, handling the politics with Disney's stable of preferred directors awkwardly. Nevertheless, we sputtered along for 6 years, now rechristened as The Secret Lab. During that time, I did more comedies, including Shanghai Noon with Jackie Chan, where we did a $2 million train crash. And Snow Dogs with Cuba Gooding Jr.
Pete's sake, 7241 Queen, move it! Or you're gonna be the hood ornament on a 737!
And we became acquainted with Walt Disney Imagineering, which was trying to finish the new California Adventure Park. I was assigned to a couple of media projects for that park.
Yes.
One was for the bakery tour.
Yum!
Another was for a 70mm epic showcase called Golden Dreams, which gave a glossy, politically correct history of California. It was the first time I dealt with 70mm film, and I was really excited to work on such a big canvas. Unfortunately, I soon discovered that the format raised as many problems for us as the benefits it provided. But we got through it. Lessons learned. The film itself, unfortunately, was not well received. But we stood by our work. Plus, it contained the first 4,000 frame composite shot that I'd ever worked on. After Golden Dreams, another theme park project came up. This one for the new Disneyland Paris Studio Park. Titled Cinemagique, it was another 70mm delivery, but that didn't really faze me now. This one would be a journey through the history of movies, where our hero gets sucked into scenes from classic films. We would be recreating settings and scenes from favorites like Wizard of Oz, Safety Last, Pinocchio, Titanic, and you guessed it, Star Wars. The show combined live actors, theatrical effects, and film effects. Not only was it a loving tribute to the movies, but it actually packed an emotional wallop as well. Audiences adored it, and it ran for over 46,000 performances. Cinemagique would become a career favorite project for director Jerry Reese, producer Tom Fitzgerald, and myself as visual effects supervisor. And then the worst happened. In 2002, despite their substantial financial investment in it, Disney decided to shutter the secret lab. Most DreamQuest employees now found themselves on the street. Political winds had shifted in the executive suites of the Walt Disney Company, and we suddenly found ourselves without supporters in the halls of power, so they closed us down. For me, it was a catastrophic event, suddenly being thrust back into the freelance market. For one, all the visual effects work in California was in the process of being moved overseas. Domestic studios were closing at a record pace, so there were few jobs to be had in California. My resume and my reel meant very little. Secondly, I had depended on DreamQuest for 10 years to supply projects for me to work on. The reputation of the studio was good enough to give clients confidence, but it never translated into a deep roster of personal industry connections for me. My days as a visual effects supervisor were now numbered. In fact, they were over. I just didn't know it yet. I took what small gigs I could get for several years, mostly compositing, matte painting, and some set supervision for projects that would be finished in another studio without me. I did manage to land a year's work reconstructing a mess of a VFX studio owned by an aging and eccentric child star. Let's just call this person Norma Desmond. I was able to bring in a bunch of my buddies to rebuild the decimated studio and finish a 500-scene project that had been about to collapse. We had to complete 200 composites for a studio screening in 2 weeks, starting basically from an empty building. Our resulting success and decent reviews for the film provided the inertia to land us enough additional work to last a few months. But ultimately our owner was so quirky and irrational that eventually he drove all the clients away. And I found myself wandering in the freelance wilderness again. By this time, even more film production had left California. Finally, after many months of development, my producer friend from Georgia the Jungle days attached me to a new film that was to be shot in Australia. The director of photography was Alan Davio, a brilliant, gentle giant who had photographed E.T. the extraterrestrial. The production manager, Bernie Williams, was a great British gent who took me under his wing. He had worked for Kubrick and even had Patrick McGowan's The Prisoner on his resume, so I was a bit starstruck. The director on this film was an insecure young guy, barely out of film school it seemed, but he had some talent. We did pre-production in LA and flew off to Australia for what was to be a 6-month shoot. Once we got down there, however, the director decided for whatever reason that he didn't care to work with me. So they gave me the boot. I was in good company, however. He had fired his superstar director of photography even before he fired me. So talent, and even personality, obviously had little to do with it. He was simply marking his territory. But that didn't keep me from being crushed and unemployed. Unfortunately, this was the last straw. After getting back to LA, I watched one prospect after another collapse. I'd had a nice long run, far better than most people I'd gone to film school with, but for the first time I seemed completely unable to land a job. The Lord had always protected us and provided for us, but for some reason He now needed to really humble me. We started to make plans to sell the house and move the family back to Colorado to live in my folks' basement. We had very little other choice. I didn't know what we'd do in Colorado, but at least we'd have shelter. I was really broken. It was the lowest point we had ever been, but God wasn't quite done with me yet. Out of nowhere, the phone rang. It was my friend Ken Horry from Walt Disney Imagineering. He ran the WDI Media Effects Department, which had itself been struggling for projects, so I didn't expect much. He wanted me to come in and talk about this Disneyland submarine ride enhancement project, so I took a meeting. They were converting the ride to a Finding Nemo attraction. I figured that maybe they wanted me to do storyboards or tests or something. Mr. Horry started to give me a tour of the facility. In my dazed state, I politely followed him through the hallways, but soon it began to dawn on me that he wouldn't be doing this if he wasn't bringing me in for full-time employment. I had a job. Okay, it wasn't a staff position, but it paid money. I had a job. So in 2005, I began working in Glendale and, like a dog who had been kicked too many times, was determined to keep my head down, do the work, and stay out of trouble. I was incredibly grateful to God for His provision. Directing films or even working on films at all was now a dream that was a distant, fading memory. But God had definitively shown me that my ways are not His ways. He patiently shepherded me toward what was important and provided for me and my family, and moved me toward a career that would help to strengthen other families and bring more joy to the world. I didn't realize it at the time, but for the submarine project, I would be breaking ground in technologies that would be my new stomping grounds for the next 15 years, projection effects, using projected video in strange ways to accomplish real-world illusions. The subride was converted from wet-for-wet environment into a mostly dry-for-wet illusion, with animations of Nemo characters projected on scrims to give a dimensional effect. I had to invent a new system that combined layout and screen mapping so that the Pixar animators would know where to put their characters. After that, I would be animating things like bubbles and lava, then installing it all while sitting in a parked yellow submarine in the middle of the night. Could it get any better than this? Visual effects in movies and television, when I began my career, were created only by mysterious technological witch doctors. But by this time in 2005, effects had begun to be commoditized. Producers began to believe you could buy magic by the pound. It had become a buyer's market, as digital technology had started to allow anyone to get into the fray. But now I'd crossed over into the theme park world. Rather than creating magic for the screen, I was creating illusions in the real world, an exhilarating and challenging new frontier that made me feel like a pioneer again instead of an assembly line worker. Plus, the people I got to work with at Imagineering were often smarter, kinder, and less full of ego than their equivalents in the film business. This was a place I could be comfortable. When I began at the Glendale campus, our digital effects department was a mere handful of people, and most of us weren't even staff. As a result, we had to wear many hats, and any projects that came our way were opportunities to learn, have fun, and make a difference. I had the opportunity to contribute new effects to classics such as The Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. I got to work with a group of Imagineers in a laboratory sandbox to develop new projection effects that expanded our tool set. In Disneyland, some of these new techniques were applied to Snow White's Adventures, Alice in Wonderland, Indiana Jones, and Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. In Trader Sam's Tiki Bar at the Disneyland Hotel, if you order certain drinks, you might see something like this outside the window. In Epcot's spaceship Earth, I led a team to create a time portal depicting a woolly mammoth battling with a group of cavemen, even directing the live actors who were playing the cavemen. Some of them were football players in real life. It figured. I also got to work with legendary animator Eric Goldberg, adding Donald Duck to Epcot's Mexico Pavilion. Later on, Frosty effects animations were my contribution to the new Frozen overlay of the Norway Pavilion. Over in Disney's Hollywood Studios, we created and installed an interactive Jack Sparrow attraction with a special appearance from a Johnny Depp hologram. In 2010, we were involved in providing various shows and environments for Disney's new larger cruise ship, the Dream. Strangely, I was asked to help redesign the decor of some of the spaces in the ship, including children's play areas and the entryway to the Animator's Palette restaurant. Being a media guy, I'd never seen my designs actually created in marble before. Pretty cool. We also were heavily involved in creating 2 media-heavy dinner shows for the Animator's Palette restaurant. As a result, I ended up with the task of redesigning the wall layouts for the entire restaurant. Then I was tasked with creating the opening and closing sequences for the Undersea Magic Show. For another show, called Animation Magic, dining guests designed their own character in a template on their placemat. Later in the show, they get to watch their own drawing performing with classic Disney characters. I was in charge of prepping the backgrounds for the new animations, as well as designing the placemat itself. The show, another Jerry Reese special, was and is a big hit with guests.
Never had a friend like me.
As we were wrapping up the Disney Dream project, however, my health took a downward turn. Once we made it back to California, I was pretty sick. After several months of clinics and doctors and antibiotics and tests, they finally made a diagnosis. I had chronic lymphocytic leukemia. In fact, I have the second nastiest flavor of this particular disease. I could fill the rest of this video with sick boy stories, but I won't. The bottom line is I went into treatment and got into remission in about 6 months. I never even really missed any days of work. The trouble is, though, there is no cure, and the disease could and would return. But in God's providence, it just so happens there has been a cascade of amazing new treatments coming on the market for my disease, more than any other type of cancer. Ooh, I said the C word, sorry. Anyway, I kept working. My next big project was an attraction for an expansion of Hong Kong Disneyland. Hong Kong's park is the smallest Disney park. If you were to go there, its initial layout seemed like California's Disneyland. But then you quickly find that there are things missing where you expect them to be. Additions like Mystic Manor have attempted to address some of the deficiencies. Under the leadership of Joe Lancicero, in collaboration again with pal Jerry Reese, we set ambitious standards for this e-ticket attraction. Free-range vehicles, laser effects, lots of mechanical and projection magic, and a finale that utilizes 20 projectors and blows out a whole wall of the gallery using concepts I helped design every 53 seconds all day long. Mystic Manor has become a favorite must-see attraction in the Hong Kong park, and I, along with my bride, get to welcome every single guest as they enter. You see, the very first image guests see as they enter the attraction depicts a fictitious 1916 opening day for the mansion. Since I was doing the artwork, I added both myself and Maureen in the crowd. I also added a young Walt Disney and his brother Roy. After much negotiating with a corrupt and headstrong government in communist China, the Walt Disney Company finally made a deal to build a new park in Shanghai. It was a monumental project for which Imagineering had to bulk up substantially in order to deliver. Despite the difficulty of dealing with the Chinese managers, the attractions were to be large and ambitious, including a huge, completely new version of Pirates of the Caribbean. I was attached to that project and developed several of the spectacular effects. Because the air in Shanghai is so unhealthy, my supervisor recommended that I not travel for the final installation because of my health. So I stayed in the US. Nevertheless, I contributed to 5 total attractions in the Shanghai park. And it was an immediate success. But that success came at a price. After having hired many new Imagineers for the Shanghai project, the Disney Company, now exhausted in human and financial terms, had to shed a large number of employees. I was experienced with previous Disney layoffs, so I knew they weren't very delicate or nuanced about it. This time I managed to keep my job, but the unfortunate, unforeseen consequence of the way they did it was that they ended up losing many of the most experienced and knowledgeable middle managers, the folks that held the tribal knowledge that made Imagineering function. I had spent 10 years developing relationships with these managers. They all depended on me to help them get their projects through. They knew my talents, and we had shorthand that helped us communicate and function well. So even though I wasn't laid off this time, I might as well have been, as all my best contacts for the fun projects went away. New management had no idea who I was and preferred to bring in their own friends. From that time on, I struggled to get on big shows and never was allowed to head up a major team again. Frustrating as that was, however, I was still having fun. I was still an Imagineer. I would push the magic wherever I could push the magic. I would take the small projects and make them look big. In Paris's Disneyland Park, we added 6 new effects in a whirlwind 4-day installation to their budget-challenged Peter Pan upgrade. Despite that, of the 3 Peter Pan attractions I've been involved in around the globe, this one came out the best in my opinion. We also added the same new climactic scene to Big Thunder Mountain in Paris that we pioneered in California. Finally, I was involved in a long overdue upgrade to Paris's version of the Haunted Mansion called Phantom Manor. My assignments were adding stormy skies to several scenes and animating new changing portraits for the entry hall. Curiously, thanks to artist Greg Pro, one of the paintings in the hallway features a cowboy who bears a strong resemblance to yours truly. So now I'm one of the 999 happy haunts that inhabit Phantom Manor. Meanwhile, over in Tokyo, I was assigned to Sea Rider, my 5th worldwide Finding Nemo attraction. In this one, guests get shrunk to the size of a fish to swim and play with Nemo and his friends. I worked on the pre-show where a demonstration of the shrinking process begins the experience. And I also contributed the shrink effect to the main show in this simulator ride. Another Tokyo project was the Beauty and the Beast ride. I contributed media bits all through the attraction. But my main focuses were the Be Our Guest scene, and the resurrection of the Beast and his transformation back to the prince. But in October of 2018, my disease started to catch up with me. The treatment I was on was failing, and I got so ill I was hospitalized for over a week, and then spent 3 months in bed as my doctor switched me over to a new treatment. That was frustrating enough, but there was a project I had been working on for several years that had become close to my heart, and the time was quickly approaching when I was supposed to travel to Tokyo to install the final show. But first I had to get out of bed. Then I had to get approval from my doctor to travel and work in a construction site thousands of miles away for 6 weeks. Through the grace of God and begrudging doctor approval, both of those things happened. I began a high-tech new drug that had come online just a month before I needed it, and sure enough, it really did the trick. I had been in a wheelchair, but by the time I boarded the plane, I could climb stairs again. I may have been shaky, but with divine help, I could now do the job. The project is called Soarin' Fantastic Flight. It's a special adaptation of the Soarin' flight simulation ride that was being installed at several Disney parks around the world. Because this one was to go in the Tokyo Disney Sea Park, in a land called Mediterranean Harbor, the existing film had to be customized to fit within the theme. The concept here is that you're visiting a museum of flight with a special exhibition celebrating the life of an early fictional aviation pioneer, Camelia Falco. I had been heavily involved in conceptualizing, designing, prototyping, and producing the introductory pre-show. When guests arrive at her special gallery, a painting of our heroine comes to life and tells us what she loves about flying. The storytelling technique of silhouettes returned to my vocabulary to help tell Camelia's story. I supervised the creation, animation, and compositing of a computer-generated falcon into the scene with an actress named Stasha Surdijk, whose unedited and highly technical performance in a language that is not her native tongue was a marvel to witness.
私は物心がついた頃から鳥のように自由に空を飛ぶことを夢見ていました。最初に飛ばした紙飛行機が空高く舞い上がった時、空を飛ぶという私の夢を多くの人と分かち合いたいと思いました。そんな思いを胸に、私は世界中の科学者や芸術家たちと協力し、空を飛ぶさまざまな手段を開発したのです。そして空を飛びたいと願い続ければ素晴らしい技術が生まれ、その夢は実現するのだと確信しました。今日は私たちの自信作ドリームフライヤーを皆さんにご紹介できて本当に嬉しく思います。皆さんの夢を見る力がこのドリームフライヤーを空高く舞い上がらせ、時空を超えた旅へと連れて行ってくれるでしょう。あれだ、ここにいる皆さんもあなたのように空を飛ぶのよ。それでは素晴らしい空の旅、ファンタスティックフライトを楽しんできてくださいね。ボンビアンジョ。
That's a pre-show?
And the Falcon worked out so well, they decided to have us put her on the big screen in the ride's main show as well. Elsewhere in the attraction, you might find additional hints that I was involved in the project. But the most pleasant surprise for me came with the reactions of our Japanese guests on social media. The vast majority of online guest comments told us they were moved to tears by this attraction. We had hoped they would enjoy it, but tears? Consistently? I got to personally stand anonymously in the attraction and observe the look of wonder on guests' faces. hear their gasps, and hear their spontaneous applause. This is the stuff you work your entire life for. They hadn't a clue who I was, but it didn't matter. We'd made a difference in people's lives, a difference that will continue with new guests every day for years to come. That's, of course, what we strive for. That's why we show up for work in the morning. But now, it's all over. My career is in the rearview mirror, and I never did manage to direct another dramatic film. Cabbages and Kings was it, one and done. In honor of its unique status, I took the time afforded by the global quarantines to meticulously restore our simple tale of a princess and a fiddler. The film finally looks the way we always wanted it to, better than it ever did even in the 1970s. Perhaps the main reason the film still resonates with me is that now I can completely empathize with our princess.
What's the matter, dearie? Did those biddies give you a hard time? Don't you listen to them? You're a steady, hard-working girl, more than I can say for some people.
No, it's not that. It's that I used to be like that.
Like her, I was born with many gifts and blessings, but I needed to be humbled before I could fully see and experience the joys and beauty of life. And now that I look back across all the years to that time, I see a tapestry of providence. God not only managed to protect me from the tyranny, temptation, and debauchery of Hollywood that might have destroyed me had I ever risen above the invisibility level, but He provided for me and my family every step of the way. He gave me everything I ever needed and everything I ever dreamed of, just not in the ways I expected. He took away my dream of being a filmmaker and gave me a second career that would bring joy to families around the world and keep the light of imagination burning. It was a fun ride. I hope you kept your hands and arms inside the vehicle.